My brother chose his own wedding as the venue to humiliate me. He didn't lower his voice, and he didn't hesitate. In front of a room full of guests, he pointed me out and laughed, telling everyone I was just an illiterate cleaner who shouldn't be trusted with anything that required actual thought. My father stood right beside him wearing a smile as he added that I had always been an empty-headed child anyway. A few people laughed. Others looked away uncomfortable. No one told him to stop. I stood there in a plain dress, hands folded tightly in front of me, occupying the exact space my family had decided I belonged on the periphery of the room, easy to ignore, and even easier to mock. The music continued to play. Glasses clinked in celebration. The ceremony moved forward as if nothing had happened. That was the part that cut the deepest. Not the words themselves, but how normal the cruelty seemed to all of them. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect. What happened next didn't begin with me speaking at all. It started when someone else finally looked my way. The wedding planner guided the guests toward the main hall, and I watched my brother shake hands with men in expensive suits, his smile wider than I had ever seen it. Daniel had always known how to work a room. He had inherited that from our father. The charm, the effortless confidence, the ability to make every person feel like they were the center of his world. At least everyone except me. I found a corner near the back of the hall where the light was dim and the noise of conversation was muffled. A server passed by with a tray of champagne flutes, and I took one just to have something to hold. The bubbles rose to the surface and vanished one by one, much like the words I had swallowed over the years. The guests around me chatted about the venue, the floral arrangements, and the impressive guest list. I caught fragments of talk about Daniel's new business venture, the investors he had courted, and the future he was building for himself. No one asked me a single question. No one even looked in my direction long enough to wonder who I was. That was by design. I had received the wedding invitation 3 months earlier at my small apartment in Philadelphia. There was no personal note tucked inside, no follow-up phone call, no message asking if I needed help with travel. It was just a formal card with gold lettering and a date circled in my calendar like a prison sentence I was forced to serve. My father called me 2 days after the invitation arrived. His voice was clipped and efficient, the tone he reserved exclusively for me. He told me it would look strange if I didn't attend. He said people would ask questions. He said I should come stay quiet and not make things difficult for Daniel on his special day. I asked him what he meant by difficult. "You know exactly what I mean," he said. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Daniel called me once a week before the wedding. He didn't ask how I was doing or if I was looking forward to the event. He simply told me there would be important people at the reception, investors, partners, potential clients. He said the wedding was as much about business as it was about love. Then he paused and added that I should probably dress simply. Nothing that would draw too much attention. Nothing that would prompt people to ask questions about what I did for a living. I told him I understood. He said good and hung up. I had been working as a cleaner for the past 4 years. Not the kind of cleaner my family imagined when they used the word like a slur, not someone scrubbing toilets in gas stations or mopping fast food floors. I worked for a high-end service that contracted with luxury hotels and corporate headquarters. I held certifications. I had regular clients who requested me by name. I earned a decent living, paid my rent on time, and had health insurance for the first time in my adult life. But none of that mattered to my family. To them, I was still the daughter who had failed to live up to expectations, the one who had dropped out of college after 2 years, the one who had taken jobs they considered beneath our family's dignity. It was the cautionary tale Daniel could point to whenever he wanted to feel better about his own choices. I watched him now standing at the center of the reception hall with his new wife Claire by his side. She was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, polished, precise, and perfectly arranged. Her dress likely cost more than I earned in 6 months. Her smile never wavered, even when she caught my eye from across the room and quickly looked away. I had met Claire only twice before the wedding. Both times, she had been polite in the way people are polite to service workers, distant, efficient, and careful not to establish any connection that might complicate things later. She knew what Daniel had told her about me. She had already made her decision about who I was. The ceremony had been brief and elegant. Daniel and Claire exchanged vows before a minister who spoke of partnership, commitment, and building a life together. I sat in the back row, far from the family section, watching my father beam with pride at his son. At one point, he turned to the guests near him and said something that made them laugh. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the way he gestured toward Daniel, his chest swelling with satisfaction. He had never looked at me that way, not once. After the ceremony, the guests filed into the reception hall for cocktails. I found my corner and stayed there watching the room arrange itself into familiar hierarchies. The important people gravitated toward the center where Daniel and Claire held court. The less important guests orbited around them like satellites, hoping to catch a momentary flicker of attention. And people like me, people who didn't fit neatly into any category, found the edges and made ourselves small. That was when Daniel made his speech. He had been drinking champagne loosened by the alcohol and the adoration of his guests. Someone asked him to say a few words, and he obliged without hesitation. He talked about his journey, his successes, and his vision for the future. He spoke of the values our father had instilled in him: hard work, discipline, and the importance of making the right choices. Then he pointed at me. He said my name like it was a punchline. He said I was proof of what happened when someone didn't take life seriously. He said I had always been the dreamer in the family, the one with my head in the clouds, the one who couldn't be trusted with anything that required actual thinking. He called me an illiterate cleaner and laughed, and a few of the guests laughed along with him. My father nodded and added his own commentary. He called me an empty-headed child, the one they had always worried about, the one who had never quite figured out how to succeed. He said it with the tone of someone sharing a mildly embarrassing family anecdote, not overtly cruel, just honest, merely stating facts that everyone already knew. I stood there with my champagne flute and felt the room shrink around me. I felt the eyes that flickered in my direction and then quickly darted away. I felt the silence of all the people who heard what was said and chose to say nothing. And then I felt something else, a different kind of attention. I looked up and saw a man standing near the front of the room. He was older, distinguished, with silver hair, and the kind of quiet authority that made people step aside without being asked. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't looking away. He was looking directly at me, his expression unreadable, his eyes steady and focused. I didn't know his name yet. I didn't know why he was watching me. But I recognized the quality of his attention. It felt different from everyone else's. It seemed to be asking a question rather than delivering a judgment. The music started up again. The conversation resumed. Daniel moved on to his next toast, his next handshake, his next performance. But the man kept looking at me, and for the first time that night, I didn't look away. The morning of the wedding, I woke up early and stayed still, staring at the ceiling longer than necessary. The hotel room was modest. I had paid for it myself. I chose this place specifically because it was 3 miles away, far enough that no one in my family would expect me to be available for last-minute errands or family photographs. My phone rang at 7:30. I didn't need to check the screen. My father's voice was calm and careful, the tone he used when he wanted obedience without asking for it directly. After a brief greeting, he reminded me to be appropriate. He said there would be guests who didn't know our family's situation. He said it would be best if I didn't give anyone a reason to ask questions. I asked him what questions he meant. "You know exactly what I mean," he said. "Keep a low profile. Let Daniel have his day. This is important for the family, Hannah. Think about that." The call ended in under 3 minutes, but the message was familiar. I was not a daughter to be supported. I was a liability to be contained. Daniel called 20 minutes later. His voice carried the effortless charm of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. He said he was glad I was coming, but the warmth was purely professional. He reminded me the wedding wasn't just a celebration, it was an opportunity, business. He mentioned investors and partners, people who mattered. He suggested I be a quieter version of myself and advised me not to talk about work. "People might not understand why someone from our family would choose to do what you do," he said. I told him I understood. He hung up satisfied. My family had always treated my job as proof that something had gone wrong with me. To them, the word cleaner was enough. No details required, no recognition of the fact that I had worked my way up to handle luxury contracts. In their eyes, I just cleaned up other people's messes for a living. What they chose to forget was that before that job, I had spent years working as a language consultant. I learned Arabic in Morocco. I had been fluent enough to navigate negotiations worth millions of dollars. They had never taken it seriously. They called it a phase, and when that firm eventually downsized, they called it a failure. I tried to explain that skills don't disappear just because a job does, but they weren't interested in explanations. They had already decided who I was, and nothing I said could change their minds. So I stopped trying. I took the cleaning job because I needed the income. Time passed. The temporary became permanent. And eventually my family's version of me became the only story anyone remembered. By the time I finished getting dressed, I knew exactly how the day would go. I would be quiet. I would stay in my designated corner. I would not contradict the story they planned to tell. The wedding wasn't about me. It was about the image they wanted to project to the world. I didn't know yet that by the end of the night, that image would shatter and their story would finally collapse on its own. The venue was a converted estate on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place that made people feel important just by breathing its air. Stone pathways wound through manicured gardens, and waiters in white jackets moved like ghosts among the guests, offering champagne and small bites arranged like museum exhibits. Everything had been designed to impress, and it was working. I arrived exactly on time, which made me the first person the parking attendant had to redirect. He looked at my 12-year-old Honda with its dented bumper and pointed toward a gravel lot behind the main building far from the entrance where the Ferraris and Mercedes were being displayed. I didn't argue. Arguing with someone who has already assessed your value is a waste of breath. Inside the reception hall was a sea of country club smiles and corporate handshakes. They greeted each other with the easy familiarity of people who share the same tax bracket and vacation codes. I stood near the entrance feeling less like a sister and more like an anthropologist studying a foreign tribe. A wedding planner approached me checking a clipboard with a professional, distant smile. She asked my name, found it at the very bottom of her list, and pointed toward a table near the service kitchen, far from the raised platform where the wedding party would hold court. I sat down alone. The other chairs at my table remained empty for a long time. I had been relegated to the obligatory section, the margin of the celebration where guests were acknowledged but not celebrated. My position on the social map was clear. I was a footnote in Daniel's success. The ceremony in the garden was beautiful. Daniel and Claire stood under a floral arch, their faces radiant. When they exchanged vows, their voices carried clearly through hidden speakers, ensuring that every important person in the room heard their promises of partnership and prestige. I watched my father in the front row. His back was straighter than I'd seen it in years, his chest swelling with pride. He had always believed Daniel was destined for greatness, and this wedding was the ultimate confirmation of his faith. I sat behind a large woman in a purple hat, invisible, watching a life I was never invited to join. After the ceremony, I found a spot near a window with my wine. Outside, the photographers were arranging the official family portrait. Daniel, Claire, and my father stood at the center glowing. I was not called. I was not asked. I stood behind the glass watching them capture a memory that intentionally left me out. A woman in expensive silk approached me briefly, mistaking me for a guest of status. "How do you know the couple?" she asked. "I'm Daniel's sister," I said. The recognition in her eyes died, instantly replaced by a careful, polite neutrality. "Oh," she murmured. "I didn't realize Daniel had a sister. He never mentioned—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. She excused herself to find someone more relevant, leaving me with the silence of a room that simply had no space for me. Dinner was a grand affair of fine china and strategic networking. As the plates were cleared, the master of ceremonies invited Daniel to say a few words. My brother rose with the effortless grace of a man who owned the room. He began with a speech about his journey, about discipline, making the right choices, and the importance of surrounding oneself with winners. The guests listened with rapt attention, nodding at his jokes and applauding his vision. He was charming, eloquent, and perfectly in control. Then the tone shifted. He looked across the room, his eyes finally landing on me in my dark corner. "Success is about choices," Daniel said, his voice amplified and steady. "And my sister Hannah is here to remind us of that. We love her, but she's always been the cautionary tale of the family, the dreamer, who never quite figured out how to function in the real world." The room grew quiet. He didn't need to shout. The silence made his next words feel like a gavel hitting a block. "She ended up exactly where her choices led her, an illiterate cleaner. Someone who handles the messes, so people like us don't have to." A few people chuckled, that uncomfortable, polite laughter of guests who don't want to seem rude by not getting the joke. But most just stared. The word cleaner hung in the air like a stain on the white tablecloths. My father stood up then, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder. He didn't look at me. He looked at the crowd. "Daniel is right," he added, his voice thin but firm. "She's always been an empty-headed child. We tried to help her, but some people simply can't be saved from themselves." The verdict was in. It was a public declaration of my worthlessness delivered by the two people who were supposed to know me best. They hadn't just insulted me. They had defined me in front of every potential employer and peer in the city. I sat at my table feeling the weight of 100 gazes. Some eyes held pity, others held a cold dismissal. I felt the story of my life being written by people who didn't even know my last name. Claire sat at the head table, her smile perfectly frozen. She didn't look away, but she didn't speak up either. She was a practical woman, and practical people don't defend those who have nothing to offer. Daniel raised his glass for a final toast, and the room dutifully followed. The clinking of crystal sounded like a closing door. I stayed in my seat, shrinking into myself, waiting for the moment to pass so I could disappear forever. But through the crowd, I felt a different kind of gaze. I looked up and saw the man with the silver hair. He was standing near the front, close enough to have heard every word. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't nodding. He was just watching me with a steady, intense focus, as if he was looking for something beneath the cleaner my family had just described. For the first time that night, the silence didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a question. I noticed the change before I understood its cause. Conversations around me grew quieter. Guests straightened their posture and adjusted their expressions. The casual atmosphere of the reception shifted into something more formal, more watchful, and more aware. Then I saw him clearly for the first time. The man who had been watching me was moving through the room, and the guests were parting for him like water around a stone. He didn't push or ask for space. He simply existed, and the room reorganized itself around his presence. His name rippled through the crowd in fragments. "Jonathan Reed, Jonathan Reed." I heard it whisper between clusters of guests who glanced at him and then quickly looked away, as if making eye contact might reveal something they weren't supposed to know. I knew the name. Everyone in certain circles knew the name. Jonathan Reed was a legend in international business, a man who had built a fortune on deals that spanned continents, who spoke 6 languages fluently, and who had the ear of presidents and prime ministers. His company had investments in energy technology, infrastructure, and a dozen other sectors I couldn't keep track of. When Jonathan Reed walked into a room, the room paid attention. Daniel noticed him immediately. I watched my brother's expression transform from confident host to eager supplicant in the space of a heartbeat. He excused himself from his conversation and moved toward Jonathan with a smile that was just slightly too wide a handshake that lasted just a moment too long. My father followed close behind his own expression, a carefully calibrated mixture of warmth and deference. He introduced himself as Daniel's father, mentioned their family's long history in the community, and hinted at values and traditions that might appeal to a man of Jonathan's stature. Jonathan listened with the patience of someone who had heard this kind of approach many times before. He nodded at the right moments and made appropriate sounds of interest, but his attention seemed to float above the conversation, landing briefly on details and then moving on. I watched from my corner and tried to figure out why a man like Jonathan Reed was at my brother's wedding. The guest list had included business associates and investors, but Jonathan was in a different category entirely. His presence here suggested either a connection I didn't know about or an agenda I couldn't guess. Daniel was explaining his latest business venture, now his hands moving as he described market opportunities and growth projections. He spoke with the confidence of someone who believed his own intelligence was obvious to everyone, and perhaps to most people it was. But Jonathan's expression gave nothing away. He listened without responding, assessed without judging, and watched without revealing what he saw. Then Daniel made a mistake. He was trying to establish rapport, to create a connection that would make Jonathan see him as more than just another ambitious young man with a business plan. He started talking about family, about traditions, about values, and about the different paths people took in life. He gestured across the room toward my table and laughed. "That's my sister over there," he said. "The cleaner. She's proof that not everyone in the family got the same drive. Some people just don't have what it takes." He said it casually, like a throwaway observation meant to demonstrate his own superiority by contrast. He expected Jonathan to laugh along, to nod in understanding, and to share the assumption that people who cleaned for a living were inherently less valuable than people who made deals. Jonathan didn't laugh. His expression didn't change at all. He simply looked at Daniel for a long moment, then turned his gaze toward me. Not with curiosity or pity or judgment, just attention. Pure, focused attention that seemed to take in everything about me in a single glance. I felt exposed under that gaze. I felt seen in a way I hadn't been seen all evening, as if someone had finally noticed that the character my family had created didn't match the person actually sitting at the table. Daniel kept talking, trying to fill the silence his joke had created. He shifted to another topic, mentioned a partnership he was hoping to develop, and asked if Jonathan might be interested in discussing opportunities. His voice had an edge of desperation, now the sound of someone who had lost control of a conversation and was scrambling to get it back. Jonathan interrupted him with a raised hand. "Excuse me," he said. "I need to attend to something." He didn't explain what. He simply turned and walked away, leaving Daniel standing with his hand extended and his mouth open. My father tried to salvage the moment, saying something about how busy important men must be, but the damage was done. Jonathan Reed had dismissed them, and everyone nearby had seen it happen. I watched Jonathan move through the room, greeting guests with brief nods and shorter conversations. He seemed to be making his way around the perimeter of the hall, and I realized with a start that his path was bringing him closer to my table. He stopped a few feet away and turned to face me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The noise of the reception continued around us, but it felt distant, muffled, as if we were standing in a bubble of silence that separated us from everyone else. His eyes were sharp and intelligent, the eyes of someone who had made difficult decisions and lived with their consequences. But there was something else in them too, something that looked almost like recognition. "Do I know you?" he asked. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried the weight of genuine curiosity. "I don't think so," I said. He studied my face for another moment, then nodded slowly. "Perhaps not," he said. "But you seem familiar somehow." He didn't elaborate. He didn't explain what about me seemed familiar or what memory he was trying to access. He simply stood there watching me with that steady, assessing gaze, as if waiting for something to click into place. Then Thomas appeared at his side, a younger man in an expensive suit, who seemed to serve as Jonathan's assistant or advisor. He murmured something in Jonathan's ear, and Jonathan nodded without taking his eyes off me. "We should talk later," Jonathan said, "if you have time." Then he turned and walked away, leaving me sitting alone at my table with my heart beating faster than it had all evening. I didn't know what had just happened. I didn't know why Jonathan Reed wanted to talk to me or what he thought he recognized when he looked at my face. But I knew something had shifted. The story my family had been telling about me was the only story anyone had heard all night. Daniel's speech had established the narrative, and my father's comments had confirmed it. I was the illiterate cleaner, the empty-headed child, the cautionary tale. But Jonathan Reed hadn't accepted that story. He had looked at me and seen something else, something that didn't fit the character my family had created. And now he wanted to talk. I sat at my table and watched the reception continue around me. Daniel was trying to recover from his dismissal by Jonathan working the room with renewed energy and reasserting his position at the center of attention. My father had retreated to a group of older men who seemed sympathetic to his concerns about the younger generation. They didn't notice me anymore. They had delivered their verdict and moved on. But someone else was paying attention now, and that made all the difference. The evening had shifted into its later phase. Dessert had been served and cleared away, and the guests had broken into smaller groups scattered throughout the reception hall. The music was softer now, background noise, rather than an invitation, and conversations had grown more intimate, more strategic. I watched from my corner as Jonathan Reed and Thomas moved to a quieter section of the room near the windows that overlooked the garden. They stood close together, speaking in low voices that didn't carry, and I saw Jonathan gesture occasionally with the economy of movement that characterized everything he did. Then I heard them switch languages. The Arabic was fluid and natural, the kind that came from years of practice rather than academic study. They discussed something I couldn't quite make out from across the room, but I caught fragments, numbers, names, references to documents, and timelines. It was clearly business, something important enough to warrant privacy, even in a room full of people who couldn't understand what was being said. Daniel noticed the language shift. I saw him glance toward Jonathan and Thomas with an expression that tried to look knowing, but succeeded only in revealing his ignorance. He laughed too loudly at something a nearby guest said, then made his way toward the window where Jonathan was standing. "Excuse me," Daniel said, inserting himself into the conversation with the confidence of someone who believed his presence was always welcome. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Jonathan paused mid-sentence and looked at Daniel with the patience of someone who had been interrupted many times before and had learned to accept it as the cost of success. "Not at all," Jonathan said. "We were just discussing some details." "It sounded complicated," Daniel said. "What language was that?" "Arabic," Thomas answered. Daniel nodded, as if this confirmed something he had suspected. He made a comment about how impressive it was to speak multiple languages, how useful it must be in international business, and how he had always meant to learn something beyond Spanish, but had never found the time. Jonathan listened without responding. His expression remained neutral, but I thought I detected a slight tightening around his eyes, the look of someone who was being patient, but wouldn't be patient forever. Then Daniel made another mistake. He gestured toward me across the room and laughed. "My sister wouldn't know what to do with a language like that," he said. "She can barely handle English, probably thinks Arabic is just squiggles." He said it as a joke, expecting Jonathan to laugh along, or at least smile in acknowledgement. He was trying to create a shared moment of superiority, a bond based on mutual recognition of who mattered and who didn't. Jonathan didn't laugh. He looked at Daniel for a long moment, then turned his gaze toward me. His expression was thoughtful, almost curious, as if he was reconsidering something he had assumed. Thomas said something in Arabic, a brief observation that made Jonathan nod slowly. I was too far away to hear the exact words, but I understood the tone. They were discussing something about me, or about what Daniel had said, or about the situation in general. Daniel stood there with his smile frozen on his face, clearly aware that something had shifted but unsure what. He made another attempt at conversation, mentioning a project he was working on, and suggesting that Jonathan might be interested in hearing more about the opportunities in his sector. Jonathan held up a hand. "Another time, perhaps," he said. "We have some things to discuss." He turned back to Thomas and resumed speaking in Arabic, effectively dismissing Daniel from the conversation. Daniel stood there for a moment longer, his smile fading, then retreated to find my father and share his confusion about what had just happened. I watched from across the room and felt something I hadn't felt all evening: hope. Jonathan and Thomas continued their conversation in Arabic, and I listened to the fragments I could hear. My own Arabic was rusty from lack of practice, but it came back to me as I focused the patterns and rhythms I had learned during my years as a language consultant, the vocabulary that had once been as familiar to me as English. They were discussing a deal, something significant, something that had been in negotiation for a while. There were concerns about cultural protocols, about communication challenges, and about finding someone who could bridge the gap between American business practices and the expectations of their partners in the Middle East. I heard Jonathan mention a phrase I recognized from my consulting days, a particular term that referred to a type of business relationship built on personal trust rather than contracts. He said they were struggling to find someone who understood both the language and the culture well enough to help navigate the final stages of the negotiation. Thomas agreed and mentioned that they had tried several consultants, but none had been quite right. They needed someone with genuine fluency, someone who understood the nuances, someone who could communicate respect and sincerity in ways that translation alone couldn't capture. I sat at my table and felt the weight of what I was hearing. They were looking for exactly the kind of person I had been, the kind of person I still was underneath the cleaning uniform and the family narrative that had buried my real skills and experience. Jonathan glanced in my direction again, and this time his expression was different. He was studying me with the intensity of someone who was putting pieces together, connecting dots that hadn't been visible before. He said something to Thomas in Arabic too quietly for me to hear. Thomas turned and looked at me. His expression shifted from curiosity to something more focused, more intent. Then Jonathan started walking toward me. My heart was beating fast now, faster than it had all evening. I didn't know what was about to happen, but I knew something was different. The story my family had told about me was about to be tested against reality, and I wasn't sure what the result would be. Jonathan stopped at my table and looked down at me with that steady, assessing gaze. "May I sit?" he asked. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He sat down across from me and folded his hands on the table. Thomas remained standing nearby, watching with the alertness of someone who had learned to pay attention to everything. "I apologize for my directness," Jonathan said, "but I need to ask you something." I waited. He spoke a sentence in Arabic, a complete grammatically correct sentence that asked whether I understood what he was saying. I looked at him for a long moment, and then I answered him in Arabic. His expression didn't change, but I saw something shift in his eyes, something that looked like confirmation. He asked another question, this time more complex, using vocabulary that would have been challenging for someone who had learned the language casually or briefly. I answered that question too. Thomas moved closer. His own expression transformed from curiosity to something approaching amazement. Jonathan asked me a third question this time about a specific business concept that required not just language skills, but cultural understanding. I answered him completely and correctly. The silence that followed was different from any silence I had experienced that evening. It wasn't the silence of dismissal or the silence of judgment. It was the silence of recalculation of assumptions being revised, of a story being rewritten in real time. Jonathan leaned back in his chair and looked at me with new eyes. "How long have you been fluent?" he asked. "Almost 15 years, I said. He nodded slowly as if this confirmed something he had suspected. "And you work as a cleaner now?" I looked at him directly and felt for the first time that evening that I didn't need to defend myself or explain my choices. "Yes," I said. "I do." Jonathan studied me for another long moment, then turned to Thomas and said something in Arabic that I understood completely. He said, "I think we may have found exactly what we were looking for." The change in the room was subtle but unmistakable. Conversations near our table had grown quieter, and I noticed guests glancing in our direction with expressions of curiosity and speculation. Jonathan Reed was sitting at my table talking to me, and that simple fact had disrupted the social order of the entire reception. Daniel noticed. I saw him across the room, his attention pulled away from whatever conversation he had been having, his eyes fixed on the scene at my table. He started moving toward us, weaving through the crowd, with the determined expression of someone who sensed something had gone wrong and needed to fix it. My father followed close behind his face, showing the same mixture of confusion and concern. Jonathan saw them coming, but didn't stand up or make any move to meet them halfway. He continued sitting across from me, his posture relaxed, his attention undivided. "Jonathan," Daniel said as he reached our table. His voice was bright, perhaps too bright. "I see you've met my sister." Jonathan nodded without looking at him. "We've been having an interesting conversation." Daniel's smile faltered slightly. He glanced at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, suspicion perhaps, or worry that I had said something embarrassing. "I hope she hasn't been boring you with stories," Daniel said. "Hannah doesn't always understand when people are being polite." Jonathan turned his gaze toward Daniel, and the temperature around our table seemed to drop several degrees. "On the contrary," Jonathan said, "your sister has been remarkably informative." Daniel's smile disappeared entirely. He looked at me again, his expression now openly confused, trying to figure out what I could possibly have told Jonathan Reed that would merit the word informative. My father stepped forward, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder in the gesture of paternal support I had seen so many times before. "Jonathan," he said, "I hope there hasn't been any misunderstanding. Hannah means well, but she doesn't always express herself clearly. If she said anything confusing—" Jonathan held up a hand and my father stopped mid-sentence. "There's no misunderstanding," Jonathan said. "In fact, I think things are becoming quite clear." He turned to Thomas, who had been standing nearby throughout this exchange, and said something in Arabic. The words were spoken at normal volume, clearly audible to everyone at the table, but they might as well have been code. Daniel and my father stood there with blank expressions, understanding nothing. I understood everything. Jonathan had asked Thomas to confirm a detail about the negotiation they had been discussing earlier, a specific cultural protocol that was causing difficulty with their partners. Thomas answered with a brief explanation of the problem, and Jonathan nodded thoughtfully. Then he turned to me and asked a question in Arabic. The question was technical, specific, the kind of thing only someone with genuine expertise would know how to answer. It concerned the appropriate way to address a concern that had been raised by the other party in the negotiation, a matter of honor and respect that couldn't be resolved through standard business channels. I answered him in Arabic. My answer was detailed and precise. I explained the cultural context behind the concern, suggested a framework for addressing it that would satisfy both parties, and referenced similar situations I had helped navigate during my years as a consultant. The silence that followed was profound. Daniel and my father stood frozen, their expressions showing the dawning realization that something was happening they didn't understand. They had heard me speaking, had seen Jonathan and Thomas nodding along, but the words themselves were meaningless to them. Jonathan turned to face Daniel. "Your sister," he said, "speaks fluent Arabic." Daniel blinked. "What? Fluent Arabic?" Jonathan repeated. "Better than many of the consultants we've worked with over the years, and she has expertise in exactly the kind of cultural negotiation we've been struggling to find help with." Daniel looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. "That's impossible," he said. "Hannah doesn't speak Arabic. She's a cleaner." Jonathan's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. "Those two things," he said, "are not mutually exclusive." My father stepped forward again, his face showing the strain of trying to reconcile what he was hearing with what he believed he knew about me. "There must be some mistake," he said. "Hannah doesn't have those kinds of skills. She dropped out of college. She never finished anything she started. She's—" He stopped himself, perhaps realizing how his words sounded in the presence of someone like Jonathan Reed. Jonathan stood up from the table. He moved slowly, deliberately, with the controlled grace of someone who knew that every gesture carried weight. He looked at Daniel, then at my father, then at me. "I've built my career on recognizing potential that others overlook," he said, "and on being willing to challenge assumptions that most people take for granted." He turned to Thomas and nodded. "We should discuss this further," he said to me, "but not here, not tonight." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a business card which he placed on the table in front of me. "Call my office tomorrow," he said. "We have a project that requires someone with your particular combination of skills, if you're interested." I picked up the card and looked at it. The name Jonathan Reed was printed in simple black letters with a phone number and nothing else. "I'm interested," I said. Jonathan nodded. "I thought you might be." He turned and walked away from the table, Thomas following close behind. They moved through the crowd with the same easy authority they had shown all evening, and the guests parted for them automatically, instinctively recognizing power when they saw it. Daniel and my father stood at my table, staring at me with expressions that mixed shock, confusion, and something that might have been the first stirrings of understanding. I didn't explain anything to them. I didn't try to fill the silence with words they wouldn't have believed anyway. I simply sat there with Jonathan Reed's business card in my hand and waited for them to figure out what had just happened. Daniel spoke first. "You speak Arabic," he said. "Since when?" I looked at him evenly. "Since before you started telling everyone I was illiterate," I said. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. I saw the ripples spread across Daniel's face, the realization that his narrative about me had been fundamentally wrong, that he had humiliated me in front of a room full of people based on assumptions that had just been proven false. My father's expression was harder to read. He stared at me as if I had transformed into someone else entirely, as if the daughter he thought he knew had been replaced by a stranger wearing her face. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked. "All these years, why didn't you tell us?" I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "I did tell you," I said. "You just didn't listen." Then I stood up from the table, tucked Jonathan Reed's business card into my purse, and walked away. Behind me, I heard Daniel calling my name. I heard my father saying something about needing to discuss this, about there being some explanation. But I didn't stop and I didn't turn around. The evening wasn't over yet. But the story my family had been telling about me was finished. The morning after the wedding, I woke up in my hotel room with a strange feeling of lightness. The heaviness that had pressed down on me for years, the weight of my family's expectations and disappointments, seemed to have lifted somehow. Not entirely, not completely, but enough that I could breathe more easily. Jonathan Reed's business card sat on the nightstand where I had placed it the night before. I looked at it for a long moment, still not quite believing what had happened. A man whose name was synonymous with international success had recognized something in me that my own family had spent years denying. He had offered me an opportunity that could change everything. I got dressed and went down to the hotel restaurant for breakfast. The room was nearly empty at this early hour, and I found a table by the window where I could watch the parking lot and think about what came next. My phone buzzed with a text message from my father. He wanted to talk. He said it was important. I stared at the message for a while without responding. I wasn't sure what there was to say. The events of last night had revealed a truth that my family had worked hard to bury, and I didn't know how they would handle that revelation. Would they apologize? Would they try to explain away what had happened? Would they pretend nothing had changed? A second message arrived from Daniel. He was more direct. He said we needed to discuss what had happened with Jonathan Reed. He said there might have been some misunderstanding that could affect his business relationships. I put down my phone and finished my breakfast. At 10 o'clock, I called the number on Jonathan Reed's business card. A professional voice answered and asked how she could direct my call. I gave my name and explained that Mr. Reed had asked me to contact his office. There was a brief pause, and then the voice became warmer. "Ms. Mitchell, of course. Mr. Reed mentioned you would be calling. He asked me to schedule a meeting at your earliest convenience. Would this afternoon work for you?" I said yes. The meeting was set for 3 o'clock at Jonathan's office downtown. I had 4 hours to prepare myself for a conversation that could reshape my entire life. I spent the morning reviewing everything I could find about Jonathan's current projects and the deal he had mentioned. The internet provided some information, news articles about his company's expansion into Middle Eastern markets, press releases about partnerships and investments, but the details were vague, carefully managed to reveal nothing of substance. What I did know was that Jonathan's company had been working on a major infrastructure project in the Gulf region for the past 2 years. The deal was reportedly worth several $billion and involved partnerships with government entities and private investors across multiple countries. It was exactly the kind of complex cross-cultural negotiation that required precisely the skills I had developed during my years as a language consultant. At 2:30, I drove downtown and found parking near the building where Jonathan's company was headquartered. The building was tall and modern, all glass and steel, the kind of structure that announced its importance without needing to say a word. The lobby was cool and quiet, staffed by security personnel who checked my identification and directed me to an elevator that would take me to the executive floor. I rode up alone, watching the floor numbers climb, feeling my heartbeat accelerate with each passing floor. The elevator doors opened onto a reception area decorated with understated elegance. A woman at the desk smiled and led me to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city. Jonathan was already there, seated at the head of a long table with Thomas beside him. They both stood when I entered, and Jonathan gestured to a chair across from him. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Please sit down." I sat. Jonathan studied me for a moment with those sharp, assessing eyes. "I've done some research since last night," he said. "Your background is more interesting than your family led me to believe." I waited without responding. "You worked for a firm called Meridian Consulting for 3 years," he continued. "You specialized in cross-cultural communication and language services for clients doing business in the Middle East. You were considered one of their best consultants until the firm downsized and eliminated your position." "That's correct," I said. Jonathan nodded. "And since then, you've been working as a cleaner." "Yes." "Why?" The question was direct, without judgment, and genuinely curious. I took a breath before answering. "Because I needed work," I said, "and cleaning was available when nothing else was. I had bills to pay, and I couldn't afford to wait for the right opportunity to come along." Jonathan's expression didn't change, but I thought I saw something like approval in his eyes. "A practical decision," he said. "A necessary one," I corrected. He smiled slightly, the first genuine smile I had seen from him. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, "I'm going to be direct with you. We have a problem, and I believe you might be the solution." He explained the situation in detail. The infrastructure project he was working on had reached a critical stage. The partners in the Gulf were becoming concerned about certain aspects of the agreement, not the financial terms, but the cultural implications. They felt that the American team didn't fully understand their values, their traditions, and their way of doing business. "What they want," Jonathan said, "is someone who can speak to them in their own language, literally and figuratively. Someone who understands that business in their world is built on personal relationships, not just contracts." He looked at me directly. "They want someone they can trust," he said. "And trust in their culture is earned through respect, through understanding, and through demonstrating that you value what they value." I nodded slowly, beginning to understand where this was going. "You want me to serve as a cultural liaison," I said. "I want you to do more than that," Jonathan said. "I want you to help us close this deal. The language component is important, but it's not the most important thing. What matters is whether you can help us build the kind of relationship that makes a multi-billion-dollar partnership possible." He leaned forward slightly. "I've seen your work from your Meridian days," he said. "I've spoken to some of your former colleagues. They speak very highly of you." He paused. "So the question is simple," he said. "Are you interested?" I looked at him across the table and felt something shift inside me. For years, I had accepted the story my family told about me, the failure, the disappointment, the cautionary tale. I had buried my skills and my experience under a cleaning uniform and tried to forget who I had been. But that person was still inside me. She had been waiting all this time for someone to see her. "Yes," I said. "I'm interested." Jonathan smiled again and extended his hand. "Welcome to the team, Ms. Mitchell," he said. "I have a feeling this is going to be the beginning of something remarkable." I shook his hand and felt for the first time in years like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. 3 weeks after my meeting with Jonathan Reed, I stood in a conference room in Dubai, looking out at a skyline that seemed to reach toward the stars. The buildings glittered in the afternoon sun, monuments to ambition and possibility. I felt impossibly far from the wedding reception where my family had declared me worthless. The negotiations had been intense. For days I had worked alongside Jonathan and Thomas, navigating the delicate cultural protocols that determined whether the deal would succeed or fail. My role was exactly what Jonathan had described, bridging the gap between American business practices and the expectations of our partners. I wasn't just translating words, I was translating intent. The partners had been skeptical at first. They were used to consultants who spoke textbook Arabic, but lacked the deeper understanding of honor and relationship. Everything shifted during our second day of meetings. Ahmad, the senior partner, asked about our commitment to a long-term partnership. It was a test. He wanted to know if we saw this as a transaction or a relationship. I answered him in fluid Arabic, using phrases that demonstrated a genuine respect for his values. I spoke about trust built over time and the honor of working with partners whose reputation matched their ambitions. Ahmad listened in silence. When he turned back to me, his face had transformed. "You understand," he said in English. "You truly understand." "I do," I replied. "And so does Mr. Reed. That's why he brought me here." By the end of the week, we had an agreement in principle. That night, Jonathan hosted a dinner at an exclusive rooftop restaurant. He raised a glass of sparkling water and proposed a toast. "To Hannah Mitchell, who has proven once again that the most valuable people are often the ones others overlook." I felt my face warm as the team raised their glasses. Later, Jonathan leaned back, watching me with that familiar, steady gaze. "I have a confession," he said. "When I first saw you at that wedding, I knew you belonged somewhere else entirely. There was something about you that didn't fit the story your brother was telling." He leaned forward, his voice dropping an octave. "Your family made a mistake. They saw what they expected to see, and they never bothered to check if their story was true. But stories only have power as long as people believe them. Once you stop believing, the whole narrative falls apart." I thought about my brother standing at his wedding reception, pointing at me and laughing, my father nodding along as if every word were true, and the guests who accepted their version of me without question. And then I looked at where I was now. The story had fallen apart, and in its place, a new one was being written. I returned to the United States a week later, stepping off the plane with a signed contract and a new position as Jonathan Reed's Senior Cultural Liaison. The title came with a salary that was more than I had earned in the previous 5 years combined, along with travel opportunities and professional responsibilities that matched my actual capabilities. The news traveled fast. My phone had been buzzing with messages throughout the flight, congratulations from former colleagues who had heard about my involvement in the deal, interview requests from business publications, and LinkedIn notifications from people I hadn't spoken to in years, and messages from my family. Daniel had texted 3 times, each message more urgent than the last. He said he needed to talk to me about what had happened. He said there were things that needed to be clarified. He said our father was very upset and wanted to understand the situation. My father had called twice, but hadn't left voicemails. I didn't respond to any of them. The first few days back were busy with paperwork and logistics, setting up my new office, meeting team members, and reviewing upcoming projects. I threw myself into the work with an energy I hadn't felt in years, grateful to have something concrete and demanding to focus on. But I knew I couldn't avoid my family forever. And on the 4th day back, I received a text from my father that was different from the others. "I need to see you," it said. "Please." I stared at the message for a long time before answering. "Fine, tomorrow afternoon." The meeting was at my father's house, the same house where I had grown up, where Daniel and I had played in the backyard, and where our mother had cooked dinner every night until cancer took her when I was 15. I hadn't been back in almost 2 years, and pulling into the driveway felt like traveling backward in time. My father answered the door. He looked older than I remembered, smaller somehow, as if the past few weeks had taken something out of him. "Thank you for coming," he said. Daniel was in the living room, sitting on the couch where we had watched television together as children. He stood up when I entered, but he didn't move toward me or try to embrace me. "Hannah," he said. "Daniel," I said. We stood there in awkward silence, 3 people who shared blood but not understanding. My father gestured toward a chair. "Please," he said. "Sit down." I sat. The conversation that followed was painful in ways I had expected and in ways I hadn't. My father began by saying he didn't understand what had happened at the wedding. Not my humiliation, which he still seemed to view as minor, but Jonathan Reed's interest in me. He asked how I had fooled such an important man into thinking I was qualified for a job that was clearly beyond my abilities. "I didn't fool anyone," I said. "I have the qualifications. I've always had them." Daniel shook his head. "That's impossible," he said. "You dropped out of college. You've been cleaning houses for years. You can't just suddenly be fluent in Arabic and an expert in international business." I looked at him for a long moment. "I didn't suddenly become anything," I said. I've been fluent in Arabic for 15 years. I worked as a cultural consultant before Meridian downsized. You knew about all of this, but you chose to forget it because it didn't fit the story you wanted to tell. Daniel's face flushed. "That's not fair," he said. "You never told us." "I told you constantly," I interrupted. "You just didn't listen. Every time I mentioned my work at Meridian, you changed the subject. Every time I tried to explain what I actually did, you made jokes about me not being practical. You didn't forget. You chose not to know." The room was silent. My father spoke next, his voice quieter than before. "Why didn't you say something at the wedding?" he asked. "When Daniel made those comments, why didn't you correct him?" I looked at my father with an expression that mixed sadness and something harder. "Because I've spent my entire life trying to correct you," I said, "and it never worked. You decided who I was when I was a child, and nothing I've done since then has changed your mind, so I stopped trying." I stood up. "The difference now," I said, "is that someone else finally saw me for who I really am, someone who actually matters in the world you care about, and now you can't pretend anymore." Daniel stood up too. "Hannah, wait," he said. "We need to talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about," I said. "You made your feelings clear at your wedding in front of everyone. You called me illiterate. You called me an embarrassment. You used me as a prop to make yourself look better." I moved toward the door. "I'm not angry anymore," I said. "I was for a long time, but I'm not now. I just don't have anything left to prove to you." Daniel followed me. "What about Jonathan Reed?" he asked. "What did you tell him about me?" I turned to face him. "I didn't tell him anything," I said. "You did that yourself at the wedding. He was watching when you humiliated me. He heard every word." Daniel's face went pale. "He saw you treat me like I was worthless," I said. "And then he saw me demonstrate exactly how wrong you were. I didn't have to say anything. You made the introduction yourself." I opened the door. "Goodbye, Daniel. Goodbye, Dad." I walked out into the afternoon sunlight and got into my car. Behind me, I heard Daniel calling my name. I heard my father saying something about family and forgiveness and working things out. But I didn't stop. I had spent years waiting for my family to see me as I really was. I had hoped that someday, somehow, they would recognize the person I had become and give me the acknowledgement I had always craved. Now I understood that I didn't need their recognition anymore. I had found people who saw my value without being forced to see it. I had built a career that reflected my actual abilities. I had proven to myself and to the world that the story my family told about me was fiction. Their opinion didn't matter anymore, and that was the real victory. Not the job, not the money, not even Jonathan Reed's respect. The victory was finally being free. The months that followed were the most fulfilling of my professional life. I traveled to 4 countries on 3 continents, working on projects that utilized every skill I had developed over the years. I built relationships with partners who respected my expertise and sought my counsel. I earned promotions and recognition that I had once thought impossible. And I heard through various channels about the consequences my family was facing. Daniel's business had hit a rough patch. Not a catastrophic failure, but a series of setbacks that damaged his reputation and cost him opportunities he had counted on. Some of it was bad luck, the kind of random misfortune that affects everyone eventually. But some of it, I learned, was connected to what had happened at his wedding. Word had spread through the business community about how he had treated his sister, the sister who turned out to be a respected consultant working with Jonathan Reed on some of the biggest deals in the industry. People who had seen his behavior at the reception told others. The story grew and changed as stories do, but the core remained the same. Daniel Mitchell had publicly humiliated a family member who turned out to be more accomplished than he was. In the world of business relationships and reputation management, that kind of story had consequences. Not dramatic ones, not the kind that made headlines, but the slow erosion of trust and respect that came from people deciding they didn't want to be associated with someone who had such poor judgment. My father's circle of friends and colleagues had also shifted. Some of the people who had witnessed his comments at the wedding had quietly distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the memory of laughing along at someone who had been so thoroughly vindicated. I took no pleasure in their difficulties. Whatever satisfaction I might have felt was overshadowed by the fundamental sadness of the situation, a family so invested in its hierarchy that it had destroyed any possibility of genuine connection. Then 6 months after our last conversation, Daniel called me. His voice was different than I remembered, quieter, more uncertain. He asked if we could meet just the two of us to talk. I almost said no. I had built a new life, one that didn't require his approval or his presence. I had moved on from the pain of that wedding night and the years of dismissal that had preceded it. But something in his voice made me hesitate. "Fine," I said. "One meeting." We met at a coffee shop in a neighborhood neither of us lived in, a neutral territory where we could talk without the weight of family history pressing down on us. Daniel looked older than he had at the wedding. Thinner, more tired, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. He ordered coffee and then sat across from me in silence for a long moment. "I don't know where to start," he said finally. "Then just start," I said. He took a breath. "I've been thinking about the wedding," he said. "About what I said. About what Dad said." He looked down at his coffee. "I told myself it was just a joke," he said. "That you knew I didn't really mean it. That everyone understood it was just family teasing." He shook his head. "But it wasn't," he said. "I meant every word. I believed it. I believed you were exactly what I said. You were a failure who had wasted her potential." He looked up at me. "And I was wrong," he said. "Completely wrong. About you, about your abilities, about everything." I listened without responding. "The thing is, Daniel," I continued, "I don't know why I believed those things. You told me about your work at Meridian. You told me about your language skills. You tried to explain what you actually did, but somehow in my mind it never registered. I kept seeing you as the kid sister who couldn't keep up, who needed to be guided, who had failed where I had succeeded." He paused. "I think I needed to see you that way," he said. "I think I needed someone to be less successful than me so I could feel better about my own life." I took a sip of my coffee and considered his words. "That's probably true," I said. Daniel flinched slightly, as if he had hoped I would contradict him. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know that probably doesn't mean much after everything that happened, but I am. I'm sorry for what I said at the wedding. I'm sorry for the way I've treated you for years. I'm sorry for not seeing you as you really are." I looked at him across the table, my brother, the golden child, the one who had always been praised and favored and celebrated. He looked lost now, uncertain, like someone who had woken up to find that the map he had been following didn't match the territory. "I appreciate you saying that," I said, "and I believe you mean it, at least right now." Daniel nodded. "But I have to be honest with you," I continued. "I don't know if this changes anything between us. You spent years building a story about who I was, and you told that story to everyone who would listen. Some of those people still believe it. Some of them always will." I set down my coffee cup. "And even if they didn't," I said, "I'm not sure I want the kind of relationship where I have to constantly prove my worth to be treated with basic respect. I did that for too long already." Daniel's expression was painful, but he didn't argue. "So, where does that leave us?" he asked. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Maybe we start over slowly and see what happens. Maybe we stay polite strangers who share a last name. Maybe something in between." I stood up. "But I can tell you one thing," I said. "I'm not going back to being the person you thought I was. That version of me never existed except in your imagination, and I'm done pretending otherwise." Daniel stood up too. "I understand," he said. "And for what it's worth, I hope we can find our way to something better." I nodded. "Maybe we can," I said. "Maybe." I left the coffee shop and walked out into the sunshine. The conversation hadn't resolved anything definitively, but it had shifted something between us. Whether that shift would lead to reconciliation or simply to a more honest distance, I couldn't say. What I could say was that I had spoken my truth clearly and without apology. I had set boundaries that I would maintain, and I had refused to pretend that the past could be erased with a single conversation. That was enough. For now, that was enough. The morning light filtered through the windows of my apartment, casting long shadows across the floor. I had been awake for hours, sitting in the comfortable chair by the window, watching the city come alive below me. It had been a year since my brother's wedding, a year since I had stood in that reception hall and felt the weight of my family's judgment pressing down on me. Everything had changed since then, and yet, in the ways that mattered most, I was still the same person I had always been. There was a strange paradox to transformation. My circumstances had shifted dramatically, a career that fulfilled me, colleagues who respected me, and financial security. But the skills that earned these rewards were not new. The Arabic fluency, the cultural understanding I had developed these years ago, they had been inside me all along, waiting to be valued. What had changed was not my abilities. What had changed was who was paying attention. My father and I had reached an uneasy detente. He had apologized, eventually admitting he had failed to see what was right in front of him. Daniel and I had dinner once a month for a while after that. The conversations were careful, avoiding the minefields of our shared history. We were building something new slowly, though I had stopped needing the validation they could never quite give. I was free, not just from them, but from the weight of their expectations. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city stretching toward the horizon. If I could speak to those still living through their own versions of my story, I would tell them this. The story others tell about you is not the truth. It is their story shaped by their own limitations. Your value exists whether or not anyone notices. It grows every time you develop your skills and become more fully yourself. The best response to those who underestimate you is not anger. It is simply becoming undeniable. I remembered the way Jonathan Reed had looked at me that night at the wedding, seeing through the story my family was telling and recognizing that it didn't match the person standing in front of him. That recognition had been a gift, but the person he recognized had been there all along. She had just been waiting, and now she was free. If you've ever felt unseen, remember their blindness says nothing about your worth. Your value is yours alone, and someday if you keep growing, someone will see what they've been missing. When that happens, you won't need to say a word. Your life will